Chapter 9: Intellectual Self-Defense. Today's sophisticated practices of information curation and propaganda require that we equip ourselves for intellectual self-defense, lest we become indoctrinated by the propaganda of the moment. Listen to this excerpt from a letter written to an individual on behalf of the Universal House of Justice. Quote, "The aim of the Baha'is is to reconcile, to heal divisions, to bring about tolerance and mutual respect among men. And this aim is undermined if we allow ourselves to be swept along by the ephemeral passions of others." In this era, we are bombarded with information from all directions. It is vital to learn how to remain skeptical or neutral in the face of so much information. Yet it is alarmingly easy to get swept up in a narrative, in propaganda, in an official-looking news report that might amount to merely a series of statements or claims, perhaps unsupported by any evidence whatsoever. Yet often we automatically accept such statements or claims, perhaps especially when they are delivered to us through an official-looking platform or individual. Why are we so easily convinced of something, willing to accept a claim even without verifying the proof? Partly this is due to the power of story. Human beings have learned through stories for thousands of years. We are equipped for it, and so we are quite accepting of receiving information through stories. In the same way that when we go into a movie theater, we suspend our judgment and accept the story we're being shown, we also can yield to the same tendency of automatic belief when we're watching the news or a presentation of any kind. In the modern era, we are accustomed to verifying our personal and wider reality through the legitimization of broadcast media. For the most part, we are oblivious to the fact that we reflexively accept and trust the depictions provided to us through such channels. We often assume that these channels or platforms have our best interests in mind. The reporters seem professional and responsible. We scarcely perceive the editorial parameters that various platforms set around each topic, and therefore we unconsciously often limit our own understanding of a topic to such parameters. We assume that professional news organizations have done the requisite digging for facts, and we are content with the results of their supposed investigations. We are thus easily taken advantage of by the sponsor or faction that has influenced the angle of the story by underwriting the information we are consuming. One of the negative effects of this pattern is to prejudice us for or against certain ideas or situations. We automatically come to adopt a particular position based on no actual verification or research of our own. And usually we don't even realize this. We often hold a particular belief simply because we heard someone say it or multiple people repeat it, and it made an impression. But it can be even worse than that. Sometimes blindly trusting an expert is considered proper behavior. Sometimes propaganda is used to discredit the practice of demanding proof. For instance, during the COVID years, there was a narrative being propagated that we should listen to experts, trust the science, and people who say they are doing their own investigation into the origins or details of the virus, or alternative forms of treatment are probably conspiracy theorists and foolishly mistrust qualified individuals. And they foolishly mistrust qualified individuals. This trust the experts narrative was rolled out at the same time that governmental regulatory agencies, corporations, institutions, and spokespersons were regularly and repeatedly and verifiably found to be presenting falsehoods or being deliberately misleading about a long list of things related to COVID. For instance, in March 2020, Americans were told that, quote, 2 weeks to flatten the curve was a necessary response to the coronavirus that had recently emerged. A group of experts and authorities were given a platform at the White House and frequent media exposure to convince Americans to engage in 15 days of quarantine-like behavior to slow the spread of the illness, after which things could go back to normal. But Deborah Birx, one of the main authorities behind the strategy, later explained in her memoir that the 2-week strategy was a ruse and that she was really planning more lengthy restrictions. Birx said, quote, "On March 9th and 10th, 2020, we worked simultaneously to develop the Flatten the Curve guidance I hope to present to the Vice President at week's end. Getting buy-in on the simple mitigation measures every American could take was just the first step in leading to longer and more aggressive interventions. We had to make these palatable to the administration by avoiding the obvious appearance of a full Italian lockdown. No sooner had we convinced the Trump administration to implement our version of a 2-week shutdown than I was trying to figure out how to extend it. 15 days to slow the spread was a start, but I knew it would be just that. I didn't have the numbers in front of me yet to make the case for extending it longer, but I had 2 weeks to get them." When you want a racehorse to do your bidding, you place blinders around its eyes to severely constrain its vision. This helps keep the horse running the path you desire. In a similar way for humans, manipulation of information interferes with reason and inner vision. The psychologist Carl Jung said, quote, "It is not starvation, not microbes, not cancer, but man himself who is mankind's greatest danger, because he has no adequate protection against psychic epidemics, which are infinitely more devastating in their effect than the greatest natural catastrophes." What Jung termed psychic epidemics, we might today call psychological operations or psyops. Why do some entities wield psyops or propaganda against others? The great Russian writer Alexander Solzhenitsyn once said, quote, "Men have forgotten God. That's why all this has happened." Solzhenitsyn survived the brutal labor camp system of the Soviet Union. He said, quote, "Truth eludes us if we do not concentrate our attention totally on its pursuit." When we make the effort to investigate closely, we see that the most polished and seemingly most reputable news and information platforms essentially deliver what their sponsors agree with. This becomes evident not only by examining how a platform's focus correlates to its funding sources, but also by scrutinizing the prior roles and accomplishments of so-called experts or analysts invited by the platform to provide commentary on various matters. If you turn to established news organizations for information, many of your opinions are likely created by these people. Who are they, really? So-called, quote, former members of the U.S. security state? revolving door specialists who hop back and forth between government and industry? Viewers trusting in the polished platform and in its eloquent so-called experts can feel that they are gaining insight into a situation, all the while potentially subjecting themselves unwittingly to the influence of vested interests. How do we guard ourselves from subconsciously or automatically giving up our autonomy, neglecting our duty to thoroughly investigate truth ourselves? This is a challenge. Our time is limited, after all. The vast majority of citizens do not have hours in a day to verify the claims made in news reports. The adoption of a skeptical or neutral posture towards information and claims of all kinds, which is an important aspect of the habit of investigating truth independently, is a skill or ability of vital importance in our time, particularly as it relates to the realms of broadcast media, news outlets, entertainment programming, social media trends, and information spreading platforms of all kinds. All such platforms reflect narratives that have been curated by factions with agendas, and these narratives often purposefully omit a range of information that is vital to gaining a proper perspective. This is intentional. Much programming is not necessarily attempting to inform you, but rather often aiming merely to persuade you to perform a certain behavior or adopt a particular point of view. In this digital age, we are frequently submerged in distraction, deliberately nudged one way or another, not just by influencers or businesses or entertainment programming, but also by what passes for news coverage. Malcolm X, the famous civil rights activist who was assassinated in 1965, said that, quote, "If you're not careful, the newspapers will have you hating the people who are being oppressed and loving the people who are doing the oppressing." The often invisible private interests that seek to exert influence in human affairs are motivated by various intentions, usually selfish, and thus it is wise to remain skeptical and neutral and deliberate in our pursuit of truth, and to guard ourselves, our communities, and our institutions from becoming hypnotized and co-opted by the narrative of the moment.